Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 14 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Seattle Kraken and won by a score of 6-1. This was a brief one-game road trip heading up to Seattle before the Sharks would head back home for a tough set of back-to-backs against both Winnipeg and Florida. And in previous seasons, this would have been viewed as a slightly easier matchup. Yes, nothing has really come easy for the Sharks in these past few seasons, that they have finished pretty much dead last in the entire NHL. But if you take a look at last year, the Kraken were only one spot above the Sharks in the Pacific Division. However, this year, things have gone differently for Seattle. They actually came into tonight's game in a playoff position, third place in the Pacific Division, and on top of that, were actually undefeated at home in regulation. That was until tonight, where the Sharks handed them their first regulation loss of the season, and in pretty embarrassing fashion, as the Sharks pick up this 6-1 victory, the largest gap of goals in any Sharks game thus far this year, either a win or a loss. And this would show that the Sharks were quite firmly in the driver's seat throughout much of tonight's game. However, I wouldn't go so far as to say that they were completely dominant and that this was a full 60-minute effort from them. Yes, they did more or less shut down anything that the Kraken were attempting to do 5-on-5 for the final 40 minutes here tonight, but the first period was a little bit of a different story. I would even go so far as to say that the Seattle Kraken were the better team in the first 20 minutes here tonight, despite the fact that the Sharks actually outscored them in this opening period. It starts off with a Macklin Celebrini goal that makes it 1-0, but then it is Winterton with his first career goal. He ties it up 1-1. Ethan Cardwell then responds with what ends up being the eventual game winner here tonight, with his first of the season, his second career goal, both of which coming against Seattle, and as such it is a 2-1 game and a 2-1 lead for the San Jose Sharks after 20 minutes. Despite the fact that they held the lead, I do think the Sharks were looking to improve after that first period, and improve they absolutely did. As I mentioned, the Sharks basically gave nothing to the Kraken at 5-on-5 for the rest of this game, and as such, not much of a surprise that the Kraken struggled to actually score anything. In the second period, it was only John Klingberg on the power play who would get on the scoreboard. I'll mention this later, don't you worry. That makes it 3-1 San Jose. And in the third period, it is goals from Will Smith, from Ty Dellandrea shorthanded, and then from Tyler Toffoli to turn that into a 6-1 victory here for the San Jose Sharks. Certainly the biggest win on paper for this team thus far this year. But before I get into the players to talk about, there is one aspect of the Sharks game that does need to be mentioned, and that is their penalty kill, which ends up going a perfect 6-for-6 here tonight, which obviously looks fantastic on paper, but I'm not quite yet ready to take too many victory laps about this situation. The Sharks penalty kill has struggled for the vast majority of this season, and while 6-for-6 looks fantastic, you watch this game and there were a ton of close calls. In particular, at the beginning of this third period, there were back-to-back penalties taken by the San Jose Sharks, and there were a lot of cracks being shown. There were many close calls that the Kraken were able to create. They probably should have been able to have at least 1 or 2 extra goals here tonight. It wouldn't have mattered ultimately, since the Sharks had this 5-goal lead for themselves, but the Kraken definitely with an extra bounce or 2, it could have gone their way, if not for especially Yaroslav Askarov putting up a fantastic goaltending performance here. So I'm not exactly ready to say that the penalty kill has completely turned it around, but obviously 6-for-6 still does look nice on paper. Moving on to those players to talk about, as we can see here, it is another game in which the Sharks go for the 11 forwards, 7 defensemen setup. They had done so in the last one against the Detroit Red Wings, and I had mentioned that I'm not really a huge fan of this, and I think it should only be done if you're actually forced into this situation. Well, that's exactly what ends up happening here tonight. It was expected that Michael Miso was going to be in the lineup, but he has to leave with an injury in, I believe, the morning skate or in practice, something along those lines. And so on short notice, with the Sharks' precarious roster situation and the fact that they are on the road, there isn't time to really get much of a substitution here, and so they do have to go yet again that 11 forward, 7 defenseman setup. It's unfortunate, I don't like it, but what are you going to do here? The Sharks also stick with the same top line, as they have Tyler Toffoli with Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini here tonight, and I'll start off with Macklin Celebrini here. I mean, how much more praise and just compliments can we really heap on top of Celebrini, who has just been absolutely lights out thus far this season after those rough starts in the first 2-3 games of the year? He's just been absolutely lights out. Another 3 points picked up here tonight. That puts him now on 21 on the season. That is tied for first place in the entire NHL with none other than Connor McDavid, who many people view, including myself, as the best player in the entire league. And so that is an insane accomplishment for Celebrini. And what's actually interesting about this game here tonight is that despite these 3 points, I didn't even necessarily think Celebrini was at his best. Now, don't get me wrong, this was still a good game for him, but we have actually seen better performances even this season from Celebrini, and it's actually kind of crazy to imagine, because you can think if most any other player on this team, Adam Gaudette, Jeff Skinner, Ethan Cardwell, Colin Graff, if any of those players were to pick up 3 points in a particular night, it would be, an outstanding performance for them. But the Celebrini, the bar is so high that this is a player that puts up 3 points and it's just another Wednesday for him in the NHL. That's how incredible he is. That's how amazing he is. So this was a good night for Celebrini. I don't want to be that misconstrued here. I still think he was absolutely fantastic, but I have seen better performances from him. But this is just even in a kind of middling 7-on-10 type of game, he's still able to dominate on the score sheet. When it comes to his two lineup partners, next with Will Smith, it was a bit of a rough weekend recently for Will Smith. Didn't really have those best of performances, but I do think he picked it up a little bit here tonight. Nothing outstanding, but was pretty solid throughout this game. But I do, however, want to touch on a situation here that I have seen people discuss when it comes to Celebrini and Smith being on this same line, which is this idea of actually separating both of these players so that Smith can actually learn to play on a different line from Celebrini and not really rely on him too much. And I sort of understand that idea. Obviously, it's something that makes sense to not just have one player who is completely reliant on a different one. But what I will say, a couple of things here. The first of which is that this was more important last season when Will Smith, it was expected that he would still be the second line center for this team heading into the future. But a lot of that changed when the Sharks drafted Michael Misa in this past year's draft. Now that he looks more so as that second line center of the future, and Will Smith more so looks like a future top line winger, you don't really have to separate Smith and Celebrini all that much in the future, and so keeping them together and keeping that chemistry rolling is still perfectly fine. But another thing that I do want to mention here is that it's this idea that, Celebrini is just Smith is completely dependent on Celebrini and he really needs him to actually look good. But I wouldn't even say that that's the case. Obviously Smith looks better when playing with Celebrini, but let us not forget that this isn't a one-way street. This is a relationship here where also Celebrini looks better when playing with Will Smith. Obviously Smith is missing certain factors in his game that Celebrini does have. He doesn't have that same explosiveness with his skating, that same pace and tenacity in his game. But when it comes purely to offensive talent, just raw offensive skill and hockey IQ, Smith is basically the only player on this roster currently. Maybe Misa can get there in the future, but currently he is the only player in this roster who can actually kind of be on that same level as Celebrini. And so having those two players on the same line, it does still make a ton of sense to be able to benefit from each other. And we saw that here tonight with a 2-point night from Smith and a 3-point night from Celebrini. When it comes to the third player on this line, we have Tyler Toffoli, and I have, of course, talked at length over these last few games how I don't think that Tyler Toffoli is the greatest third player to be putting in this situation, and I don't think that this game, despite the fact that it was a pretty good outing for Toffoli, necessarily changes that. However, there is one thing that I will say that I do think Toffoli actually does bring to this duo of players, and that is a certain sense of levity. Obviously a lot is talked about the good vibes between Celebrini and Smith, and there's a lot of fun things that we get to see occur off the ice with the videos that they film and the interviews that end up happening in New York, things like this. But it is definitely tough as two young players coming into your rookie season and just kind of getting beat down pretty much every single night. Remember, the Sharks, they only won 20 games last year. They lost a ton, and you can kind of get a little bit down about yourself. And so for Tyler Toffoli, you can see that he is bringing that sense of kind of optimism, that sense of happiness to that line. Obviously, I don't know exactly what's happening behind the scenes, but, for instance, on this Will Smith goal that gets scored here in the third period, 4-1, Smith is obviously pretty happy about this goal, but there's not necessarily a ton of excitement on his face until Toffoli comes in, joins that huddle, and then that's where the smiles come out. So you can really kind of see that Toffoli has this type of big brother attitude when it comes to these two young players. So yes, strictly on the ice, from a hockey perspective, this is not really a trio that actually works out all that well. And so I imagine at some point in the future, hopefully this season, this will be shifted. But you definitely cannot deny that there is some kind of off-ice chemistry between these three players, and that maybe that does have a positive effect. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, still no William Eklund here tonight, and so we see Warsawski take another crack at trying to get a second line that could somewhat work here. Last game, it was Wenberg and Kurashev being joined by Jeff Skinner, and this game, it is Adam Gaudette who makes his return to the lineup. We have seen Gaudette have a lot of success playing on the Sharks' third line previous this season, and then he was also given a spot on the top line where he struggled immensely. Well, Warsawski decides to split the middle here and have him on the second line, and this doesn't quite work out. There's not a ton of chemistry that actually exists between Gaudette and these two players. Actually, I'll highlight both him and Kurashev, who I thought didn't have bad games tonight. They actually got decent zone time, but it didn't lead to a ton of great chances and offensive opportunities or anything of that nature. And so these two had somewhat quiet nights, still all right, because the game as a whole was pretty good at 5-on-5 for the San Jose Sharks, but this is not really a kind of second line that you're really hoping to hang on to. And the big takeaway when it comes to these players is that you hope that William Eklund can be available for the next game on Friday, because the second line desperately needs him. Now, I did highlight both Gaudette and Kurashev, who I thought were somewhat invisible. Didn't mention Alex Wenberg, because I actually thought Wenberg had a pretty solid outing here yet again. Now, to be fair, he gets to play significantly more ice time compared to these players. Wenberg was over 20 minutes and Gaudette was only just barely above 13 minutes. That is a massive difference, but it is because, as I've mentioned multiple times, Warsawski is a huge fan of Wenberg. He has a ton of trust in him, and Wenberg at the very least has been delivering over these last few games. He had that great pass to Ethan Cardwell on that second goal of the night, and I thought generally he played a pretty good defensive game as well in 5-on-5. As I said, the Kraken were able to generate pretty much nothing, and Wenberg was involved in that a decent bit. When it comes to the Sharks' third line here, we have Skinner with Dellandrea and Cardwell. So this trio here tonight, it was all right at times, I would say. I'll start off with Ethan Cardwell, who is a player who I have always liked within the Sharks prospect pool, even prior to them drafting like Macklin, Celebrini, and even adding all of that wealth of talent. I was a big fan of Cardwell, and that has not changed with all the players that have been drafted since then. He is someone who just strikes me as a guy who really wants to, I mean, obviously everybody wants to make it into the NHL, but Cardwell seems to have that little extra bit something there. Obviously, he's not necessarily going to be that type of top six player, but he's someone who you definitely can see as a future fourth liner for this team. And the thing is that that's not even all that far into the future. In fact, I would imagine that Cardwell is ready for that position right here, right now. And I thought we saw that here tonight. Cardwell wasn't spectacular or anything, but I thought he was pretty good. He brought good energy. He scores a goal here, and definitely would not look out of place in this position. Now, I don't think it's actually going to happen. I think that the Sharks already have their kind of 13 forwards that they're going to be rocking with for the rest of this season. There is two possibilities that could allow Cardwell to maintain this spot. The first of which is if the Sharks actually do send down Michael Misa. I don't think that should happen, but it is obviously a slight possibility. And then the second option is if there is a long-term injury that occurs on this team. For instance, we know Ryan Reeves is currently on the sidelines now. If he ends up being out like 2-3 months, Cardwell obviously could end up sticking around. But outside of those two situations, I imagine Cardwell does head back down to the San Jose Barracuda. But at this point, with how he has played in this preseason and how he has looked in this brief call-up thus far, I imagine Mike Grier is likely penciling him in to a lineup spot for the next season. I wouldn't be surprised to see him really kind of make a full-time debut then. When it comes to the other two players on this line, Ty Dellandrea, I didn't think had a very good start to this game. Obviously, the Sharks were not very good in the first period in general. I think Ty Dellandrea was definitely a part of that, but he certainly improved in the final 40 minutes here tonight, so that was decent to see. And then with Jeff Skinner, a relatively quiet night for him. There were like 2-3 times where I thought he made some pretty good plays, but nothing amazing coming out from Jeff Skinner, although he did have one very, very close call to score that was just barely swept off the goal line. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, which wasn't really a fourth line, we have both Barclay Goodrow and Colin Graf. Graf, I think, actually had one of his better games of the last few. He had not been particularly great in these last few games. We didn't really get to see that kind of energy that Graf had previously been bringing to the lineup, but I did think he kind of elevated that here tonight, looked pretty solid. And then with Barclay Goodrow, I actually don't think he looked all that great. Penalty killing wise, you know, he was involved, of course, with the fact that the Sharks were able to have that perfect 6-for-6, even if it was a somewhat shaky perfect 6-for-6, but at even strength, not exactly pulling his weight. And then we have the Sharks defensively, the top pairing starting off, of course, with Orlov and Liljegren. Gonna focus on Liljegren here. As I had mentioned in the previous game, Liljegren had the worst outing out of any defenseman in that particular one against Detroit, and the big reason for that is that he was directly involved in both goals that the Red Wings scored, and both in the exact same position, sitting in front of his goaltender, screening him, preventing him from actually seeing the puck, and that's why it ends up going in. And the Seattle Kraken scored one singular goal here tonight. This one came at even strength, and would you believe it or not, Timothy Liljegren is on the ice, standing in front of his goaltender, screening him and preventing him from seeing the puck. So this is now 3 goals in a row where Liljegren has made the exact same mistake. This is definitely a bit of a problem. And now I'm not going to say that this is directly correlated to this, because obviously I've got no idea what's happening behind the scenes, but the fact that we see Timothy Liljegren take that puck to the face in that game a couple of nights ago against the Colorado Avalanche, if I am not mistaken, he leaves with that injury, he does not return, and then he immediately plays the very next game against Detroit, and now is playing tonight against the Seattle Kraken, and is having some pretty rough outings and making very similar mistakes. You have to wonder if maybe something is actually ailing him. And the thing is that if that is actually a problem here, the Sharks have the kind of resources to be able to replace Liljegren in this lineup and give him the time to actually rest and recover. They could easily have Mukhamadullin join that top pairing with Dmitry Orlov, keep Ferraro and Klingberg as the second pairing, and then run Dickinson and Desharnais as their third pairing, and boom, there's your top 6. And so Liljegren doesn't necessarily have to be here if he is not ready to. And so again, can't really prove any sort of correlation here. Maybe it's just a complete coincidence that he has made the same mistake 3 times in a row, but that is a massive, massive problem. It's one thing to make a mistake, but if you keep doing the same one, that's where it becomes a huge issue. When it comes to his defensive partner, Dmitry Orlov, I do think, once again, this is a game in which Orlov was actually pretty decent, but a little bit held back by Liljegren. So the first period didn't look fantastic for him, but he definitely brought it back in the second and third, where then he ended up being pretty good. And then we get to the Sharks' second defensive pairing. This is the massive story of the night, I would guess you could say. Obviously, I guess the massive story of the night should be the 6-1 victory, but this is always a very interesting topic of conversation, and that is with Sharks defenseman John Klingberg. Not the most popular player on this team, especially since Nick Leddy has been out for the last few games. Klingberg kind of has all the targets set onto him, and it was definitely a very interesting game for Klingberg. Before I get into that, do have to mention the power play, because there was a comment from Ryan Warsofsky just yesterday discussing John Klingberg. He was asked why Klingberg is maintaining that top spot on the top power play unit, and Warsofsky basically responded saying that the Sharks signed Klingberg to be in this spot, that they're not going to remove him from this position after just a few bad games, and also that because Klingberg had shown a lot of success doing this spot in the past, that they think that he should be able to do it in this season. And it seems as though Ryan Warsofsky would be proven right here tonight, as of course John Klingberg does end up putting up a power play goal here. The Sharks end up going 1-4-3, although technically for the top power play unit, it is 1-4-2 because they didn't get involved in any which way on the Sharks' final power play of this game. And 1-4-2 is obviously pretty impressive. That is 50%. But it does kind of remind me of that one meme. I don't know if people know what I'm going to be talking about here, where you have like that guy who's celebrating on the podium and like cracking the champagne. Oh, wow, what a huge accomplishment. But then on the next picture, you see he's actually multiple rungs down and actually finished like 20th place. This kind of feels to me what is happening here. Like, we're going to do some victory laps about John Klingberg being able to actually contribute on the power play, but when you kind of zoom out from the situation, he is still 1-for-14 since returning from injury against that Los Angeles Kings team. And in fact, this is the first power play goal 5-on-4 that he has been on the ice for this entire season thus far. So this is not actually any sort of real accomplishment, and is perhaps just like a small blip into what has otherwise been a struggle with him in this position. Now, I am hopeful that it will turn around. At the end of the day, all I really want is the San Jose Sharks to have a successful power play, and if that occurs with John Klingberg on it, or Dmitry Orlov on it, or Sam Dickinson, or even a 5-forward setup, or even Barclay Goodrow, power play quarterback in that spot, as long as the Sharks are actually scoring, I'll be perfectly fine, but I wouldn't be taking too many victory laps just because John Klingberg manages to put up a goal in this game. The other thing that I do want to mention is the fact that having Dmitry Orlov in that spot seemed to me like still it would be a win-win situation. Now it is kind of a little bit too late, but had the Sharks actually kept him in that spot, the either one case would be the Sharks power play continues to be firing on all cylinders and it's doing successful, and obviously Warsofsky can't be too upset about that, but if Orlov had faltered, then they could have made the swap to John Klingberg and there wouldn't really be many questions about it. But now you've kind of put yourself into this situation where there are a lot of questions, and I don't think one singular goal from John Klingberg should be kind of quelling those worries about this situation, despite the fact that Ryan Warsofsky was very, very ready to celebrate this singular goal that he has managed to score here in this game. Now, when it comes to his actual performance here tonight, John Klingberg did basically what you kind of were hoping for at the top of Klingberg's game, I guess you could say. There was also a comment from Ryan Warsofsky when he compared Klingberg to Erik Karlsson. Now, I think this kind of does a disservice to Erik Karlsson. Even Klingberg, at the best of his game, in the prime of his career, kind of paled in comparison to what Erik Karlsson was truly able to do in his prime. Like, he was one of the best defensemen of all time, Erik Karlsson, during moments with the Ottawa Senators, and so it's kind of a bit of an insult to Karlsson in a way. But I guess one technical kind of comparison here that exists between these two players is that they are very offensive, but they will make tons and tons of mistakes in your own zone, and you're kind of hoping that their offense is going to compensate for that. Actually, if we go back to the last season that the Sharks had Karlsson with, 22-23, Karlsson put up 101 points, absolutely insane point output for a defenseman, but defensively, he was like an absolute disaster. He basically just didn't even care about his own zone, and that's kind of what we got from John Klingberg here tonight. There were still mistakes being made. There were still him losing battles behind the net and giving the puck away. There were still times where he looked for a breakout pass and he sends it way too far behind the intended target and ends up being picked off by a Seattle player and leading to a chance. There was a moment in the third period where John Klingberg finds himself completely flat-footed, sliding to the left, giving a Kraken player a free, pretty much walk into the zone for a breakaway chance on net. Like, it was just completely crazy to see that occur. Those are the defensive errors that John Klingberg is going to make. The problem earlier on in this season is that it did not come with any positives offensively, which means it just ended up being like an absolute disaster. Here tonight, however, it did come with some positives offensively. I mentioned already the power play goal, but on this first goal from Macklin Celebrini, we see John Klingberg keep the puck in not once but twice on some pretty aggressive pinch-in plays. Now, these were not necessarily extremely impressive, like skill-wise, but not that many defensemen on this team would have actually gone for that play back-to-back. You know, you look at a guy like Vincent Desharnais, he's certainly not going to be doing it, but Klingberg has that kind of risk assessment in his game to feel as though that was the correct decision both times, and that is the type of play that can lead to offense. And so if Klingberg can put up more performances like this, where, yes, there are defensive errors, and to be fair, Klingberg is kind of lucky that these defensive errors are not ending up in the back of the net at this point for the San Jose Sharks, but if he's able to compensate for that with some actual offense here, it won't necessarily be as bad of a situation for Klingberg. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, I thought Ferraro looked relatively solid here tonight. Not many huge mistakes that he was making, so I was pretty impressed with him. And when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing here, we have Dickinson and Mukhamadullin. I'll go with Sam Dickinson first, as we continue to see a ton of confidence in his game. When the Sharks had originally drafted Dickinson and I saw him for the first time there at that rookie face-off tournament, the one player who really came to mind was Brent Burns, as like a perfect comparison to the type of energy that Sam Dickinson brings on the ice. But actually, he kind of moved away from that in the first 9 games of this season. We really didn't get to see much of Brent Burns. He was a very safe defenseman here in those first 9 games. Sam Dickinson was not really trying to do too much, just kind of handling himself in the defensive zone, nothing all too crazy. But once he has locked in for this kind of sticking around with the San Jose Sharks, once he played that 10th game, knowing he's not going to be heading back, at least not anytime soon, it has completely unlocked that type of side of him yet again. Just here tonight against Seattle, he probably was involved in the rush more than in the first 9 games combined. He was extremely aggressive. He was jumping into the play offensively. We saw him get into 2 different 2-on-1 situations. Now, unfortunately, both of them he has the puck. Both of them he is desperately searching for the pass, and as such, neither of them end up working out. But the fact that he is in these situations is still quite impressive. But it is not just him showcasing himself aggressively offensively, but also defensively. How many times in this game did we see Sam Dickinson stepping up at the defensive zone blue line, or just from inside of his own zone, and just interrupting the entries for the Seattle Kraken. They must have had 4, 5, 6 times where he's just whacking these pucks away. In fact, on the Ethan Cardwell goal, he actually makes the play at the defensive zone blue line to turn this one around, get it up to Jeff Skinner, who then passes it to Wenberg, who passes it to Cardwell for this goal. So he doesn't get at the actual assist here since it is the tertiary assist, but he was very much involved with that goal being scored. And so both offensively and defensively, we are seeing the value that Sam Dickinson is able to bring, and it definitely reminds you of Brent Burns. But there is also the kind of downside of what Brent Burns was bringing to the San Jose Sharks. In particular, in this first period, there were about 2 shifts here where Sam Dickinson was caught on the ice for an extended period of time, and he definitely could say he looked a little bit lost in the defensive zone, occasionally dropping his own proper positioning. Now, this cleaned itself up very well in the second and third, and he actually ended up having a very solid game, I would say Sam Dickinson did, but definitely some Brent Burns type of energy here, but still very positive performance for him to follow up on a very positive performance in the previous game as well. So he's looking like an entirely different player, which again speaks to the whole confidence speech that I gave in my last review. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Shakir Mukhamadullin continues to be incredibly steady, incredibly solid. He had a great stretch pass over to Tyler Toffoli to continue to contribute on the scoreboard here in the limited amount of games that he has actually played thus far this season. It continues to kind of beg the question of why ever throughout this season was Shakir Mukhamadullin actually a healthy scratch, because he is just one of the more steady and solid defensemen on this entire roster thus far. And so again, impressed with him. And then finally, we have Vincent Desharnais as that 7th defenseman, used pretty heavily in a penalty killing role. And as I mentioned with Goodrow, there were a lot of struggles on the Sharks penalty kill, but at the very least, it didn't let in any goals. So that is somewhat of a positive there. So certainly not a terrible night for Desharnais. And then finally, we get to the Sharks goaltender Yaroslav Askarov. We know this has been a kind of up and down season for Askarov. There have been some really, really rough outings, but there have also been some good positives. And the good news is that most of those positives have been in the recent outings for Askarov. The previous game, he played rather well, and here tonight, he was fantastic. He didn't have to do a ton at even strength, as I said, but as I also mentioned, the Seattle Kraken easily could have had 1, 2, maybe even 3 power play goals here tonight with the amount of chances that they ended up getting, and Askarov stood tall time and time again. There is still the slight worry here when it comes to his rebound control. There were multiple chances that were popping up that the Sharks were doing a pretty good job of clearing away, but still something that does need to kind of get under control here. But otherwise, Askarov, very solid performance, and you could definitely make the argument he was the best player of the night. I don't even think that's all that crazy to say. And then that'll do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday. They'll be taking on the Winnipeg Jets. The schedule does not get any easier. They've been facing off against some really tough playoff teams thus far, and yet they have been quite successful over their last 4. They are 3-0-1, and we'll see if they can take on the team that was top of the Western Conference just last season. Class dismissed.